She didn't ask. She didn't hesitate. Flight attendant Becky Marsh walked straight up to seat 3A, planted both hands on the armrests, leaned into the face of a 17-year-old boy, and said loud enough for the entire first-class cabin to hear, "I don't know how you got this ticket, but people like you don't belong up here." She said it like it was obvious, like it was a fact written somewhere that everyone already knew. The boy in the gray hoodie didn't flinch. He just looked at her steady and quiet, and that stillness seemed to make her angrier than any argument ever could. What happened next would bring an entire airline to its knees. If this story already has your blood boiling, you are exactly where you need to be. Subscribe to this channel, follow this story all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Ronald Thorne had been awake since 4 in the morning, not because he wanted to be, not because he was the kind of teenager who bounced out of bed before sunrise with energy to spare. He was awake because his phone had rung at 3:47 a.m., and when he saw the name on the screen, Dad, he already knew something was wrong. His father never called that early. His father barely called at all anymore, not since the company had consumed every hour of his waking life. Robert Thorne, CEO of Vertex Systems, one of the most powerful logistics and technology conglomerates in the country, was not a man who made calls in the middle of the night unless the world was already on fire. Ronald had answered on the second ring. "Hey," he said, his voice thick with sleep. There was a pause on the other end. Then his father's voice came through quieter than usual, like something had been taken out of it. "Ron, I need you to come to Atlanta." That was all it took. Ronald was already sitting up. "What happened?" Another pause. "They think it's my heart. I'm at Piedmont." Don't panic. Just get on a plane." Ronald had been dressed in 6 minutes. He grabbed the nearest clean things he owned. A gray hoodie, dark joggers, white sneakers, threw a charger and a change of clothes into a backpack, and called a car to JFK. His mother was in London for a conference. His older sister was somewhere over the Pacific on a 14-hour flight to Tokyo. There was no one else. It was just him, a prepaid, first-class ticket his father's assistant had booked over the phone at 4 in the morning, and a 5.5-hour flight between him and the only parent he had left in the country. He didn't think about what he was wearing. He didn't think about how he looked. He was thinking about his father's voice, about that unfamiliar hollowness in it, about what it meant that Robert Thorne, a man who had built an empire on the back of his own relentlessness, had sounded for just a moment scared. Ronald moved through JFK on autopilot. Check-in, security. Gate C-14. He sat in the boarding area for 20 minutes with his headphones on, not listening to anything, just kneading the barrier. He watched the gate agent, a heavy-set man in his mid-40s with the name Greg stitched onto his lapel badge, scan boarding passes with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times and expected nothing unusual to interrupt his morning. When Group 1 was called, Ronald stood up, pulled out his phone to show the digital ticket, and walked to the front of the line. Greg looked at the screen, then he looked at Ronald, then back at the screen. "This says first class," Greg said. "Yeah?" Ronald said. Greg's eyes moved over him slowly. The hoodie, the joggers, the backpack. He had the look of a man doing math in his head that wasn't adding up the way he wanted it to. "You sure this is yours?" Ronald felt the first flicker of something in his chest, not quite anger yet, more like recognition. He'd felt it before, that specific quality of being looked at like a question mark, like an anomaly that needed to be resolved before it was allowed to proceed. "My name is Ronald Thorne," he said, keeping his voice even. "Seat 3A. You can check the manifest." Greg typed something, looked at his screen. His jaw shifted slightly like he was chewing on something that didn't taste right. Then he scanned the pass and handed the phone back without another word. Ronald walked down the jetway. He found 3A easily. Window seat, spacious. He settled in, tucked his backpack under the seat in front of him, and leaned his head back. Around him, other first-class passengers took their seats, business people in tailored blazers, a couple in their 60s with matching carry-ons, a woman in her 40s reading something on a tablet. None of them paid him any particular attention. He was just another person on a plane. He closed his eyes. He didn't open them again until he heard her voice. "Excuse me." It was polite enough in the word itself, but there was something underneath it, a tone, a texture that made it feel like the opposite of polite. Ronald opened his eyes. The flight attendant standing over him was a woman somewhere in her late 30s, blonde hair pulled back tightly, a pressed uniform, and an expression that someone might mistake for professional concern, but was in fact something else entirely. Her name tag said, Becky. "Can I help you with something?" she asked. The emphasis on you was so slight that someone not paying attention might have missed it. Ronald caught it. "I'm good," he said. "Thank you." She didn't move. "I just want to make sure you're in the right seat." Ronald looked at her steadily. 3A, that's me. "Do you have your boarding pass?" He picked up his phone and showed her the screen. She leaned in, squinting at it like she expected to find an error, like she was hoping to find one. "This is a first-class ticket," she said. "I know," Ronald said. Her smile was thin. "It's just these tickets run several $1,000s. I want to make sure there wasn't a mix-up at the gate." Around them, the cabin had gone quiet in that particular way that happens when people are pretending very hard not to be listening. Ronald felt the heat of it, the awareness, the weight of other people's attention pressing in from all sides. "There wasn't a mix-up," he said. "My name is Ronald Thorne. That's my seat assignment. My boarding pass was scanned at the gate. Is there something specific I can help you with?" Becky's smile didn't falter, but something behind her eyes shifted. She was recalibrating, deciding something. "I'm going to need to verify your ticket with the gate agent," she said. "Would you mind coming with me for just a moment?" "I would mind," Ronald said. His voice was calm, completely calm. "I'm in my assigned seat. I'd like to stay here." The shift in the cabin was palpable. Someone cleared their throat. The couple in their 60s exchanged a glance. Becky straightened up slowly, the professional mask still in place, but strained now at the edges. "I understand," she said. "I'll be right back." She walked to the front of the cabin and disappeared behind the partition. Ronald stared straight ahead. His jaw was tight. He pulled out his phone and checked the time, 20 minutes to departure. He thought about calling his dad. He decided not to. Not yet. He didn't want to worry him with something like this when he was lying in a hospital bed. He'd handle it. 3 minutes later, Becky came back. She wasn't alone. Greg, the gate agent, had come down from the jetway and was standing at her shoulder, and there was something about the way the two of them moved together, that specific coordination that told Ronald this had already been decided before they walked back in. "Sir," Greg said, his voice carrying just enough authority to catch the attention of everyone nearby, "we're going to need you to come with us." "Why?" Ronald asked. "We have a concern about the validity of this ticket. I showed you my boarding pass at the gate. You scanned it. It's valid. There may have been a system error. We need to verify your identity and your purchase." Ronald looked at him for a long moment. "Are you asking anyone else in this cabin to verify their identity and purchase?" Greg's expression tightened. "This isn't about anyone else. This is about your ticket." "My ticket is valid," Ronald said. "My name is Ronald Thorne. I am 17 years old. I am traveling to Atlanta because my father is in the hospital. I am not leaving this seat." He said it quietly. There was no heat in it, no edge. Just the plain facts laid out one at a time with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where he stood. Becky leaned in slightly. "Sir, if you don't come with us voluntarily, we're going to have to call a federal air marshal." Something cold moved through Ronald's chest. He recognized the threat for what it was. He understood what that kind of escalation meant, what it could become, and he understood it with a clarity that no 17-year-old should have had to develop, but that some 17-year-olds develop anyway, because the world teaches it to them early. "Call whoever you need to call," he said. "I'll wait." They left. He sat. The couple in their 60s, the woman in particular, was watching him now with an expression of open discomfort, though Ronald couldn't have said whether the discomfort was on his behalf or because of him. The man on the tablet had stopped reading. A middle-aged man in a navy suit across the aisle was looking at Ronald with something that might have been sympathy or might have been calculation. No one said anything. Ronald kept his hands loose in his lap and breathed through it. 4 minutes later, a man appeared at the front of the cabin. He was built like someone who had once been an athlete and never entirely stopped. Broad through the shoulders, slightly thick in the middle, short-cropped hair, going silver at the temples. He was in plain clothes, dark slacks, gray jacket, but the posture gave him away instantly. The way he moved, the way his eyes swept the cabin before settling on Ronald. The badge he flipped open as he approached. Federal Air Marshal, Kent Miller. "Ronald Thorne," he said, not a question. "Yes," Ronald said. Miller looked him over with the thorough impersonal assessment of law enforcement doing an evaluation. "I need you to come with me, son. I've already explained to your colleagues that I'm in my assigned seat with a valid boarding pass," Ronald said. "I'm not a security risk. I'm a minor traveling alone to see my hospitalized father." "I understand that," Miller said, and his tone was almost reasonable almost. "But we've received a report and I'm required to investigate. If you cooperate, this will be quick and simple." "What kind of report?" Ronald asked. "A concern about your presence in this section of the aircraft." Ronald looked at him. "A concern about my presence," he repeated slowly. "Sir, my presence," Ronald said again. And this time there was something beneath the words, not anger, something more precise than that something that came from having to be very, very careful with how you express the truth in situations exactly like this one. You're a federal air marshal. You were called because a flight attendant and a gate agent decided they didn't like the look of me in this seat. That's what this is. Miller's expression didn't change. "I'm asking you to come with me voluntarily. And if I don't..." The pause that followed was exactly as long as it needed to be for everyone in the cabin to understand what the next sentence would cost. "Then I will remove you," Miller said. Ronald sat very still for 1 second, 2 seconds. He thought about his father. He thought about the hospital room, about the voice on the phone at 3:47 a.m., about the distance between here and Atlanta and how it was getting longer by the minute. He thought about what it would look like, what it would do if this got worse right now in this cabin with all these people watching. He stood up. He didn't look at Becky. He didn't look at Greg. He picked up his backpack, slung it over one shoulder, and walked to the front of the plane with Kent Miller at his back. Every step felt deliberate. Every step felt like something he was doing on purpose, not because he was afraid, but because he was choosing to control what he still could. They came off the jetway and into the terminal. Miller didn't speak. 2 airport security officers fell into step alongside them without a word, and that the appearance of 2 more bodies sent a visible ripple through the terminal. Travelers stopped walking. A woman holding a coffee cup turned and stared. Someone lifted a phone. Ronald looked straight ahead. They brought him into a room behind a set of unmarked doors, small fluorescent-lit a table with 2 plastic chairs, and a security camera mounted high in the corner. Miller pulled the door shut. One of the security officers stood against the wall. The other left. "Sit down," Miller said. Ronald sat. "I want to call my father," Ronald said. "That's not possible right now." Ronald looked at him. "I'm a minor. I have the right to contact a parent or guardian." "Once we've completed the verification process." "What verification process?" Ronald said. "You haven't charged me with anything. You haven't told me what I've done wrong. You pulled me off a plane because a flight attendant called you. That is the only thing that has happened here." Miller sat down across from him and folded his hands on the table, with the patience of someone who was used to winning these conversations through attrition. "We've received information suggesting your ticket may have been fraudulently obtained. From who? That's not information I'm able to share." "From Becky," Ronald said flatly. "The flight attendant who told me people like me don't belong in first class. That's who gave you your information." Something moved across Miller's face, just briefly, a flicker of something that might have been discomfort. "The ticket was purchased this morning," Miller said, shifting ground. "A last-minute first-class purchase for a minor traveling alone. That raises flags." "My father's assistant purchased it. My father is Robert Thorne, CEO of Vertex Systems. He has accounts with AeroVantage Airlines. You can verify all of this if you'd like to try." Miller studied him. "Robert Thorne?" "Yes." "That's a significant claim." "It's not a claim," Ronald said. "It's the truth, and every minute you spend in this room with me is a minute I'm not on that plane getting to my father, who is in a hospital right now. So I'm asking you one more time to let me make a phone call." Miller leaned back in his chair and looked at the boy across the table from him for a long time. Ronald held his gaze and didn't blink, didn't fidget, didn't show him anything except certainty. Finally, Miller said, "Who are you really, kid?" Ronald placed both hands flat on the table. "I told you who I am," he said. "The question is whether you're going to believe me before or after this gets a lot worse for everyone involved." For a moment, the room was completely silent. Then Miller reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a notepad, and set it on the table. "Give me the name again," he said. "Robert Thorne, Vertex Systems. My name is Ronald James Thorne. I'm 17 years old. I live at 84 Ashford Lane, Rye, New York. My father is currently at Piedmont Atlanta Hospital. I am not a security threat. I am a son trying to get to his father." Miller wrote. Ronald watched him write. Outside the door, through the thin walls of the security room, he could hear the muffled sounds of the terminal. Announcements, footsteps, the world moving on without him, every second carrying him further from where he needed to be. "I need to make that call," Ronald said. His voice for the first time had something in it that wasn't quite steadiness, something small and human and close to breaking. "Please." Miller looked up from his notepad. He looked at Ronald the way someone looks at a person when they're finally actually seeing them for the first time, and something in his expression changed. He reached into his other pocket and slid his personal cell phone across the table. "Make it quick," he said. Ronald picked up the phone. His hands were perfectly steady as he dialed his father's number from memory. It rang once, twice. Then a nurse answered and Ronald said, "I need to speak to Robert Thorne. Tell him his son is calling. Tell him it's urgent." There was a shuffle on the line, a murmur of voices, and then his father's voice came through rougher than Ronald had ever heard it, worn down but present alive. "Ron, what's wrong?" "Dad," Ronald said quietly, his eyes on Kent Miller the entire time. "I need you to listen to me. I'm in a security room at JFK. They pulled me off the plane. I need you to make a call." The silence on the other end lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then Robert Thorne's voice changed completely. It became something Ronald had only ever heard in boardrooms and negotiations, in moments when someone had made the catastrophic mistake of underestimating what his father was capable of. "Give me the name of the airline," Robert said. "Aerovantage." "Who's in the room with you?" "Federal Air Marshal Kent Miller." Another silence, then "Put him on." Ronald held the phone out across the table. "He wants to speak with you," he said. Miller stared at the phone for a moment. Then he reached across and took it. What happened in the next 45 seconds would later be described by Kent Miller in his written statement to the airline's internal review board as the most clarifying professional experience of his life. He would write in careful, measured language that he had entered the conversation with one understanding of the situation and exited it with an entirely different one, and that the transition between the two had been swift, unambiguous, and impossible to misinterpret. He handed the phone back to Ronald without a word. His face was the color of chalk. Ronald raised the phone back to his ear. "Dad," he said. "You're going to be fine," his father said. "Stay calm. It's already done." "What's already done?" But the line had gone quiet. Not disconnected, Ronald could still hear his father's breathing, just quiet in the way of someone who had shifted into a mode of operation that didn't require conversation. Robert Thorne was working, and when Robert Thorne worked quietly, entire systems felt it. Ronald lowered the phone slowly. Across the table, Kent Miller was staring at the wall with the expression of a man watching his entire morning reconstruct itself around a fact he hadn't known was there. The security officer by the door shifted his weight. Ronald placed the phone back on the table gently. "So," Ronald said, and he kept his voice completely, perfectly, devastatingly neutral. "Where would you like to go from here?" No one answered. The fluorescent light buzzed softly overhead. Somewhere beyond the walls, the terminal moved and breathed and carried its thousands of lives forward. And in Atlanta, in a hospital room on the 4th floor of Piedmont, a man who had built something enormous from nothing lay in a bed with monitors beeping steadily beside him, holding a phone in both hands, and making the kind of calls that changed things, the kind of calls that couldn't be unmade. The phone sat on the table between them like a grenade with the pin already pulled. Kent Miller hadn't moved. He was still looking at the wall, his hands flat on the table, his breathing controlled in the deliberate way of someone who had trained themselves not to show what was happening inside them. But Ronald could see it anyway. It was in the stillness, in the way Miller's jaw had locked into place, in the way he hadn't said a single word since he'd handed the phone back. Ronald waited. He was good at waiting. He'd learned it from his father, who believed that silence was the most powerful thing a person could deploy in a room. Robert Thorne had once told him during one of those rare Saturday mornings, when the two of them shared breakfast before the phone calls started, that the person who speaks first after a significant moment almost always loses the advantage. Ronald hadn't fully understood what that meant when he was 12. He understood it completely now. The security officer by the door cleared his throat. "Marshal Miller." Miller blinked, came back into the room. He looked at Ronald, and for just a fraction of a second, something that might have been regret crossed his face before the professional mask came back up over it. "Mr. Thorne," he said. He'd dropped the son. He'd dropped the sir. He was using the name now directly with a formality that hadn't been there 15 minutes ago. "I'm going to step outside for a moment." "Of course," Ronald said. Miller stood, buttoned his jacket with 2 quick mechanical movements, and walked out. The door didn't slam. It closed with a soft, precise click that somehow felt louder than any slam could have. The security officer remained stationed by the wall, eyes forward, face carefully neutral. Ronald leaned back in his plastic chair and looked at the ceiling. His father was making calls. He knew what that meant. He'd seen it once before, not directed at him, but at a vendor who had broken a contract with Vertex Systems, under circumstances Robert Thorne considered not just unprofessional, but deliberately dishonest. Ronald had been 14, sitting in his father's home office doing homework while his father worked, and he'd watched over the course of 40 minutes as his father made 6 phone calls in a quiet, measured voice and dismantled that vendor's relationship with 3 separate financial institutions. No shouting, no threats. Just facts deployed with surgical precision by a man who knew exactly how much weight his name carried and had spent 20 years making sure that weight kept increasing. He thought about that now, about the calls being made, about what his father's voice must sound like at this hour in a hospital bed running on whatever energy he had left, methodically dialing numbers that would set things in motion. He thought about Becky Marsh and her thin smile. He thought about Greg at the gate doing math that didn't add up. He thought about Kent Miller saying the word son in that particular tone, and then saying Mr. Thorne in that entirely different one, and the distance between those 2 words being exactly the length of one phone call. The door opened. Miller came back in. He wasn't alone this time. Behind him was a woman Ronald hadn't seen before, mid-50s, sharp-featured in an Aerovantage Airlines management blazer with a senior staff lanyard around her neck. Her name tag read Patricia Wells, Station Director. She looked like someone who had been pulled out of a meeting and was still processing the reason why. She looked at Ronald and then looked at Miller, and whatever Miller had told her in the hallway was written plainly on her face. "Mr. Thorne," she said, pulling out the chair across from him and sitting down without waiting to be invited. "My name is Patricia Wells. I'm the station director here at JFK for Aerovantage Airlines. I want to start by saying—" "Is my flight still at the gate?" Ronald asked. She paused. "The flight has been slightly delayed pending because of me. There were some circumstances. Patricia," Ronald said, and he used her first name the way his father used first names, not casually but with intent, establishing something. "I was removed from a plane by a federal air marshal based on a complaint filed by a flight attendant who told me, and I quote, that people like me don't belong in first class. I am 17 years old. I am traveling on a valid first-class ticket purchased this morning by my father's executive assistant. My father is Robert Thorne. I assume that name has been communicated to you." Patricia Wells' expression confirmed that it had been. "I want to get on that plane," Ronald said. "That's all I want. I want to get on that plane and get to Atlanta. Everything else that happens after that, and a great deal is going to happen after that, will be determined by whether or not I make that flight." Patricia glanced at Miller. Miller gave her nothing. She looked back at Ronald. Her voice, when she found it, was carefully modulated. "Mr. Thorne, I want to assure you that what occurred today does not reflect the values or the standards of AeroVantage Airlines, and we take these matters—" "Did Becky Marsh file a formal security complaint against me?" "A beat. There was a report filed, yes." "On what grounds?" "Concern about ticket validity and—" "My ticket was valid. The gate agent scanned it. I sat in my assigned seat. The only thing that was different about me, compared to the other passengers in first class, was what I was wearing and what I look like." He let that sit for exactly 2 seconds. "So I'll ask you again. On what grounds?" Patricia Wells pressed her lips together. To her credit, she didn't look away. "I understand what you're saying, Mr. Thorne, and I want you to know that an internal review has already been initiated." "By whom?" "By our corporate office." Ronald felt something shift in the room. His father hadn't just called the airline. He'd gone up, past the gate supervisor, past the station director, past the regional manager, straight to corporate. The internal review hadn't been initiated because Patricia Wells thought it was the right thing to do. It had been initiated because someone above her, far above her, had made it not optional. "Am I free to go?" Ronald asked. Patricia glanced at Miller again. Miller said quietly, "Yes." Ronald stood up. He picked up his backpack. He looked at Patricia Wells and said with no particular heat, just clarity, "I need to be escorted back to that gate, and I need someone to make sure my seat is still available." She nodded once. "Of course." They walked out of the security room and into the terminal, and this time the formation was different. Miller was beside Ronald, not behind him. Patricia was on his other side. 2 airport staff cleared a path ahead of them. It was the same terminal, the same fluorescent-lit corridor, but the geometry of it had changed entirely. 3 minutes ago, Ronald had been pulled through this space like a problem being removed. Now he was being moved through it like someone whose presence required accommodation. People stared. Of course they stared. A few of them had their phones up. Ronald kept his eyes forward and his face neutral and his shoulders straight. And he walked like his father had taught him to walk, like you belong exactly where you are in every room you enter at all times, no exceptions. They reached Gate C-14. The jetway was still connected to the aircraft. There were passengers milling near the gate area, some who had deplaned during the delay, others who'd been waiting. A woman in her 30s with a toddler on her hip. A man in his 60s in a brown cardigan who was watching the approaching group with keen, intelligent eyes. A young couple leaning against the wall, both looking at their phones. Greg was still at the gate counter. When he looked up and saw Ronald walking toward him, flanked by the station director and the Federal Air Marshal, something happened to his face that Ronald would remember for a long time. It wasn't quite fear. It wasn't quite guilt. It was the specific expression of someone who has been entirely certain about something and has just received irrefutable evidence that they were wrong and who has not yet decided how to hold that information. Greg looked at Patricia. Patricia looked at Greg with an expression that communicated in the compressed language of institutional hierarchies that this was not a moment for conversation. Greg looked back at his screen and said nothing. Patricia turned to Ronald. "Your seat is still assigned to you. The crew has been informed that you will be reboarding. Is there anything else you need before you board?" Ronald thought about it for a moment. "Yes," he said. "I want it noted formally in writing, with a timestamp that I was removed from this aircraft by a Federal Air Marshal at the request of a flight attendant and gate agent, that no valid security concern was documented or substantiated, and that I am now reboarding with the full knowledge and facilitation of AeroVantage Airlines station director." Patricia's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "That will be noted." "Thank you," Ronald said. He walked down the jetway. The aircraft was quieter than before. Some passengers had gotten off during the delay and hadn't yet reboarded. The ones who were still in their seats watched him come back through the first-class cabin with varying degrees of expression, some blank, some openly curious. The man in the navy suit across the aisle with something that had shifted since before, something closer now to recognition. Ronald settled back into 3A. He put his backpack under the seat in front of him. He straightened up. He put on his seatbelt. He looked out the window at the tarmac and breathed slowly through everything that was moving through him. The anger, the exhaustion, the relief, the residual trembling of adrenaline that he'd been keeping very tightly controlled for the past hour and 15 minutes, and that now had nowhere to go except through him quietly while no one watched. A different flight attendant appeared, younger than Becky. Brown hair, genuinely uncertain expression, a name tag that said, Claire. "Can I get you anything?" she asked. "Water," Ronald said. "Please." She brought it in 30 seconds. She set it down gently without comment and moved away. Ronald drank half of it in one go. He set the cup on the tray. He closed his eyes. He was aware in the distant way of someone who was too tired to fully process things that Becky Marsh was not in the first-class cabin anymore. He didn't see Greg when he'd passed the gate counter on the way back down. Not at the counter, not in the jetway, not anywhere. They'd been removed, not asked to step aside, removed, before the plane had even pushed back. Ronald understood what that meant about the calls his father had made and what had been communicated in those calls. This hadn't been a suggestion. This had been a directive delivered from a level of the organization that didn't traffic in suggestions. The plane began to move. Ronald kept his eyes closed as they taxied out to the runway. He felt the subtle shifts of the aircraft's weight, heard the engines build, felt the familiar press of takeoff push him back into his seat. And then the ground fell away and they were climbing, and the city spread out below them in the gray morning light and got smaller and smaller until it was just a texture, just a pattern, just the shape of a place he was leaving behind. He thought about his father. He thought about the word heart, said at 3:47 in the morning in a voice stripped of its usual certainty. He thought about the fact that the next hour and 40 minutes were entirely outside his control. He couldn't land faster, couldn't make his father stronger from here, couldn't do anything except sit in this seat in this sky and wait. And Ronald Thorne, who had learned patience from a man who had built patience into the architecture of everything he did, was discovering that there was a kind of waiting that patience couldn't touch, the kind that came from love. The kind that sat in your chest like a stone and pressed. Claire appeared again softly. "Would you like a blanket?" "No," Ronald said. "Thank you." She nodded and left him alone. In the row behind him, two men who had been speaking quietly since reboarding had apparently decided that the situation was safe enough to discuss openly. Ronald heard his own name, not Ronald. "Just Thorne," said in a low voice, followed by something about the airline, followed by the other man saying, "You saw what happened though, right? Before they took him off." "I heard what that woman said to him." Everybody heard it. A pause. "That kid didn't say anything back, just sat there." "Which is exactly what you'd want your kid to do." Another pause. "That woman is gone now. Did you notice in the guy at the gate?" Silence. "That's not nothing," the second man said. Ronald kept his eyes closed and said nothing and listened to the engines carry him south. 30,000 feet below, in a glass and steel tower in Midtown Manhattan, the president of AeroVantage Airlines North American operations was on a call he had not been expecting to take this morning. His name was Dennis Farrow, and he was 53 years old and had been in the airline business for 27 years, and he could count on one hand the number of times he had felt genuinely physically cold during a business conversation. He was currently feeling it for the 5th time. The voice on the other end of the line belonged to Marcus Webb, who was the lead attorney for Vertex Systems and who had a reputation in corporate legal circles for being meticulous, relentless, and entirely devoid of anything resembling bluster. Marcus Webb did not make threats. He made statements. The distinction was important because threats contained the possibility of being negotiated away, and Marcus Webb's statements did not. "You should understand," Marcus Webb said in his unhurried way, "that what occurred at JFK this morning constitutes at minimum a violation of your airline's own anti-discrimination protocols, a potential breach of federal aviation regulations regarding the removal of passengers, and a series of actions taken against a minor that may have significant civil liability implications. I want to make sure that's the first thing you understand before we discuss anything else." Dennis Farrow pressed his fingers against his eyes. "I understand that, Marcus." "Good. Because the second thing I want you to understand is that my client is not interested at this time in pursuing anything quietly. He was in a hospital bed when his 17-year-old son called him from a security room where he was being held without substantiated cause. You should think carefully about what that means in terms of disposition. We've already initiated an internal review." "Dennis," Marcus said, with a patience that was somehow more unsettling than any impatience would have been, "I'm not calling about the internal review. The internal review is your concern. I'm calling to let you know that by the time that plane lands in Atlanta, Robert Thorne will have had 2 hours and however many minutes to decide what he wants the next chapter of this story to look like. I am extending you the professional courtesy of that information so that whoever needs to be making decisions on your end has time to make them." The call ended. Dennis Farrow sat in his chair and looked at his desk for a moment. Then he picked up his phone and dialed Mark Donahue's direct line. Mark Donahue was the CEO of Aerovantage Airlines. He was 61 years old, gray-haired, pragmatic, and the kind of man who had survived 3 industry contractions and 1 near bankruptcy by knowing with exceptional speed when a situation had moved beyond the category of manageable and into the category of existential. He answered on the first ring. "Talk to me," he said. Dennis talked. There was a silence when he finished, a long one by Mark Donahue's standards. "Robert Thorne," Donahue said finally. "Yes." "His kid, off our plane, at JFK." "Yes." Another silence. "Who authorized the marshal call?" "It appears to have originated with a flight attendant and gate agent acting on their own judgment." "Yes." The sound that came from Mark Donahue's end of the line was not quite a word. It was the sound of a man absorbing something that was going to require a great deal of work to address and who was simultaneously rapidly calculating the scope of that work. "Get me everything," Donahue said. "Every piece of documentation, every incident report, every name. I want a full timeline on my desk in 2 hours, and get me the number for Robert Thorne's office." His attorney called Dennis. "I don't want the attorney. I want Robert." A pause. "He's in the hospital, Mark." Silence. "Then find me the best way to reach him," Donahue said quietly, "and be respectful about it." He hung up. In the hospital room on the 4th floor of Piedmont, Atlanta, Robert Thorne set down his own phone and leaned his head back against the pillow. The monitors beside him beeped their steady rhythm. His cardiologist had told him 2 hours ago that he needed rest, that whatever was happening with his heart required absolute stillness and the absence of stress. Robert had nodded with the expression of a man who fully intended to comply and had then proceeded to spend the next 2 hours doing precisely the opposite, and he did not feel the least bit sorry about it. His assistant, Diana, was in the chair beside his bed laptop, open, fielding the return calls and organizing the incoming information and taking notes in the rapid shorthand she'd developed over 12 years of working for a man who expected things to move at a pace that most people considered unreasonable. "Fleet numbers," Robert said. Diana looked up. "The contract clause covers 17 aircraft currently operating under the Vertex Corporate Partnership Arrangement. If you invoke it, when I invoke it." "When you invoke it," she corrected. "Those routes are suspended. The financial impact in the first 24 hours alone is estimated at, I know what it is." "Robert," she said it gently. She'd worked for him long enough to say his name like that. "Are you sure you want to go this far today? You're in a hospital bed." "My son was dragged off a plane," Robert said. He said it simply. No dramatics, just the sentence flat and factual, hovering in the space between them. Diana looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at her laptop. The clause language is standard force majeure plus reputational harm, she said. I can have the formal notice drafted in 15 minutes. Do it in 10, Robert said. She typed. Robert closed his eyes and listened to the monitors and thought about his son, about a 17-year-old boy who had gotten on a plane at 5 in the morning to come to his father, who had been accused of being a threat because of the color of his skin and the clothes on his back, who had sat in a security room and asked calmly to make a phone call, and who had gotten back on that plane and was right now somewhere in the sky between New York and Atlanta making his way here. He thought about the steadiness in Ronald's voice when he'd called, about the way he'd laid out the facts, calm, precise, without self-pity, and without performance. Like someone who knew what the moment required and met it exactly. He thought, I did something right. Then he thought it should not have required any of this. And the second thought was heavier than the first. Diana set her laptop on the bed beside him and turned it so he could see the screen. The notice was drafted. Clean, formal, carrying the full legal weight of the contractual arrangement between Vertex Systems and AeroVantage Airlines. A relationship worth $240 million over 5 years, a relationship that had benefited AeroVantage in ways that were measurable and that would be very specifically unmeasurable the moment it was terminated. Robert read it once, picked up a pen from the tray beside him, signed his name. Diana picked up the laptop. I'll transmit it now. Do it, Robert said. She did. At 9:14 a.m. Eastern Time, the formal notice of contract suspension arrived at 3 separate inboxes simultaneously. Mark Donahue's office, AeroVantage's legal department, and the Office of the Federal Aviation Administration. It landed with the quiet weight of something that had been done correctly and completely with no room for ambiguity or negotiation, and it sat there waiting to be found. It was found at 9:16 a.m. By 9:18 a.m., Mark Donahue's assistant had knocked on his office door with the expression of someone who wished they were anywhere else in the world. By 9:21 a.m., AeroVantage's stock had begun to move. It moved in the wrong direction. Ronald Thorne, 32,000 feet above the Carolinas, had his eyes closed and didn't know any of this yet. He was thinking about his father's voice. He was thinking about landing. He was thinking about what he was going to say when he walked into that hospital room and saw Robert Thorne for the first time since Christmas, thinner than before, with monitors attached to his chest. He was thinking that he was going to say, "I'm here, Dad. That's all. Just I'm here." Claire appeared at his elbow one more time. "We'll be landing in Atlanta in about 40 minutes, she said. Her voice was careful, considerate. "Is there anything I can get you before we begin our descent?" Ronald opened his eyes. He looked at her, and she met his gaze without looking away, and there was something in her expression that wasn't quite an apology, but was the nearest thing to one that she had the authority to offer. "I'm okay," he said. "Thank you, Claire." She nodded, started to move away, stopped, turned back. "I'm sorry," she said. "About this morning. What happened?" She said it quietly, just for him. Not performing anything. Just saying it because it was true and because she'd been in the cabin and she'd heard what Becky had said and she'd seen what they'd done and she'd said nothing, and now the absence of that spoke to her from somewhere she couldn't quite settle. Ronald looked at her for a moment. "I know you didn't do it," he said. "Thank you for saying so." She went. Ronald turned back to the window. Clouds below. The world somewhere underneath them, reshaping itself around something none of them fully understood yet, because the calls were still being made and the documents were still being transmitted, and the stock was still moving, and the names Becky Marsh, Greg, whoever Kent Miller were being written into reports that would determine what the next weeks and months of their professional lives looked like. Ronald pressed one hand flat against his chest just for a second, feeling his own heartbeat. Steady, still steady. He had made it this far. 40 more minutes and he would be on the ground, and then he would be in a car, and then he would be walking through a hospital, and then he would be in a room with his father and everything else. Everything that was already in motion. Everything that couldn't be stopped now would happen the way it was going to happen with or without him watching. But Ronald Thorne was going to be watching. He was going to be watching very carefully. The wheels touched down at Hartsfield-Jackson at 10:52 a.m. Ronald felt the jolt of landing in his chest, the way he always did, that specific combination of relief and urgency that came from arriving somewhere you'd needed to be for hours. He had his seatbelt off before the plane finished decelerating. He had his backpack on his shoulder before the fasten seatbelt sign went dark. When the forward door opened, he was already standing at the front of the cabin, and Claire, who was working the exit, stepped slightly to the side to let him through without being asked. "Take care of yourself," she said. He nodded once and walked off the plane. He moved through the terminal at a pace just below running fast enough that people stepped aside without being asked, slow enough that he wasn't creating a scene. He didn't check his phone. He didn't stop for water or a sign or anything. He followed the exit flow from memory, through baggage claim, and out into the rideshare lot where Diana had already arranged a car. The driver knew the destination. Ronald got in and they pulled into traffic, and he finally looked at his phone. 14 missed calls, 8 text messages, 2 voicemails from numbers he didn't recognize. He ignored all of it and called his father. Diana answered. "He's resting right now, but he knows you landed. The doctor has him on a monitoring protocol. They're still running tests. He said to tell you his room number is 412 and that you should eat something before you come up." "I'm not stopping to eat," Ronald said. "I told him you'd say that," Diana said. There was something warm in her voice, something almost amused. "He said, and I'm quoting directly, 'Tell that boy to eat something, or I will be extremely disappointed in the choices I made as a parent.'" Ronald almost smiled. Almost. "Tell him I'll grab something from the cafeteria. How is he actually—" Diana's pause was exactly 1 beat too long. "He's strong," she said. "He's himself. The doctors are being cautious, which is appropriate. That's genuinely all I know right now." "Okay," Ronald said. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. He put the phone down and looked out the window at Atlanta unreeling around him, the highway, the exits, the skyline growing closer. And he let himself feel for just a moment all the things he'd been compressing since 3:47 in the morning. The fear, the exhaustion, the humiliation that he hadn't fully processed yet because there hadn't been time and there hadn't been a safe place for it. He felt it come up through him like heat, like something that had been pressed flat under weight and was slowly, carefully expanding back into its original shape now that the pressure had eased slightly. He pressed his fist against his knee once, hard. Then he let it go. He had 20 minutes. He used them to be 17 years old and scared and alone in the back of a car, and then the hospital appeared ahead, and he put all of it back where it had been and got out of the car and walked inside. Room 412 was at the end of a corridor that smelled like antiseptic and recycled air. Ronald walked it at a controlled pace, passing nurses' stations and supply carts and other families in the middle of their own difficult mornings, and he knocked on the door of 412 lightly before pushing it open. Robert Thorne was sitting up in the hospital bed. He looked smaller than Ronald expected. Not weak, his father didn't look weak. His father would look commanding in a paper gown in a burning building, but smaller in the way that seeing someone you love in a context of vulnerability always makes them look smaller. The monitors were there, the IV, the wrist cuff cycling through blood pressure readings every few minutes. All of it was there. But so was the expression on his father's face when Ronald walked in. That specific expression, something between relief and pride, and the particular restraint of a man who didn't let himself show everything he felt, except in moments that were too significant to manage that expression, was also there. "You made it," Robert said. Bert. Ronald crossed the room and sat in the chair beside the bed and looked at his father, and for a moment, neither of them said anything, and the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people for whom presence was its own language. "How are you?" Ronald asked. "Better than I was this morning." Robert studied him. "And you?" "Fine." Robert's eyes moved over him with the quiet assessment of a man who had made a career out of reading situations accurately and who applied that same precision to his son. "You're not fine," he said, "but you're holding it together, which is the same thing in practice." Ronald looked at the floor. They said the words "Dad" out loud, in front of other passengers. He said it quietly, without drama, just the fact. People like you don't belong up here. She said it like it was nothing. Robert was quiet. And then they called a marshal, Ronald said. Like I was dangerous. Like I was a threat. Because I was wearing a hoodie and I wouldn't move. Robert's hands resting on the blanket over his lap tightened slightly. I know, he said. I didn't do anything wrong. I know that too. Ronald looked up at him. What did you do? From here, I know you made calls, but what actually happened? Robert held his gaze for a moment. Then he said, the clause in the Vertex AeroVantage contract gives us the right to suspend the partnership arrangement under conditions including reputational risk to Vertex Systems or its principals. I invoked it this morning. Ronald was quiet. That clause covers 17 aircraft operating under the partnership routes, Robert continued. When the notice was transmitted, those routes were suspended. The financial impact in the first day alone is roughly $4 million. Combined with the market reaction, he paused. AeroVantage's stock dropped 6% in the first hour after the notice went out. It's probably lower now. Ronald stared at him. You grounded their fleet. Partially. From a hospital bed. I had Diana handle the documentation, Robert said with the faintest trace of something that was almost a smile. I just signed. Ronald looked at the ceiling. He was processing. And the people Becky Marsh, the gate agent, terminated this morning before the plane pushed back. The station director acted on instruction from corporate. And Miller, the marshal. Miller is federal, so that's a different process. But there is an inquiry being opened. I spoke with someone at the DOT this morning. The sequence of events, the nature of the complaint, the lack of substantiated security concern, the age of the passenger, there are questions that need to be answered. Robert paused. He'll answer them. Ronald absorbed all of this. It shouldn't have needed all of that, he said. Everything you just described, it shouldn't have been necessary. I should have been able to sit in a seat I paid for without— No, Robert said. You're right, it shouldn't. And the fact that it did, the fact that this is what it required, that's exactly what we're going to make sure people understand. Ronald looked at him. What do you mean? Robert reached over to the tray beside his bed and picked up his phone. He turned the screen toward Ronald. The notifications were stacked so deep they were barely countable. News alerts, social media tags, missed calls from journalists, from other executives, from advocacy organizations. The phrase, Black CEO's son dragged off plane, had already appeared in enough headlines that Robert's phone had aggregated them into a separate folder. Ronald stared at the screen. When did this— Someone on the plane took video, Robert said, of Becky approaching you, of them calling Miller, of you being walked out. He put the phone down. It's been circulating since before the plane landed. Ronald felt something shift in his chest. Not quite dread, more like the sensation of standing at the edge of something large and understanding for the first time how large it actually was. I don't want to be a story, he said. I know, his father said. But you already are one. The question is whether we shape it or let other people shape it for us. Ronald thought about the corridor in the terminal, about the phones people had raised, about the two men in the row behind him on the plane saying in low voices that they'd heard what Becky said, that everybody had heard. There's video, Ronald said almost to himself. Clear video, Robert confirmed. You can see her face. You can hear what she says. You can see Miller's approach. He paused. Ronald, what happened to you this morning is not ambiguous, and in this particular moment that matters. In the hallway outside, a nurse walked past with a cart. The monitors beeped. The blood pressure cuffs cycled. The ordinary machinery of the hospital moved around them with complete indifference to the fact that something was unraveling several states away. Ronald sat back in his chair and looked at his father. What does Mark Donahue want? He asked. Robert raised an eyebrow slightly. He hadn't expected his son to know the name. You mentioned the CEO of AeroVantage this morning on the call, Ronald said. You said you'd contact Donahue, so what does he want? He wants a conversation, Robert said. His office has called 3 times since 9 this morning. He wants to speak with me directly. Have you called him back? Not yet. Why not? Robert looked at him steadily. Because every hour I don't return that call is an hour AeroVantage's stock continues to move in the direction it's moving. And every hour that passes without a statement from me is an hour the story develops without their preferred framing. Ronald studied his father. You're letting them feel the weight of it before you engage. Yes. That's... Ronald stopped, started again. That's cold, Dad. Yes, Robert said again simply without any apparent disagreement. A knock at the door. Dr. Felicia Okonkwo, Robert's cardiologist, came in with the particular brisk warmth of someone who cared genuinely about her patient and also needed him to comply with her instructions. She was 40-something precise, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. Mr. Thorne, she said, and then her eyes went to Ronald. This must be Ronald. It is, Robert said. She smiled at Ronald briefly. Your father's numbers are improving. I need about 5 minutes with him if you don't mind stepping out. Ronald stood up and squeezed his father's arm once before he left. He walked out into the corridor and stood against the wall with his back to the nurse's station and his hands in the front pocket of his hoodie. The same gray hoodie. He hadn't changed. He hadn't had time to change. He stood in the corridor of a hospital in Atlanta in the gray hoodie that a woman had looked at that morning and decided was evidence of something, and he breathed. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. Unknown number. He let it ring. It buzzed again immediately after. Then a text came through from Diana Ronald. There is a reporter from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution who has been calling the hospital's press line. Also, CNN has reached out to your father's communications team. We need to decide how to handle media inquiries. Please don't speak to anyone without discussing with your father first. He typed back, I know, I won't. He put the phone in his pocket. Down the corridor, a television mounted on the wall above the nurse's station was running a cable news segment on mute with closed captions scrolling below. Ronald wasn't looking at it. He was looking at the floor. But the nurse seated directly below the screen was, and Ronald heard her make a small sound somewhere between surprise and recognition, and he looked up. His own face was on the television. Not a photo, not a still. Actual footage slightly shaky shot from a phone several rows back in the first-class cabin. The footage showed the back of a flight attendant, blonde hair, pressed uniform, leaning over seat 3A, and then it showed Ronald's face as he looked up at her. His expression in the footage was so precisely what it had felt like from inside that moment, contained measuring steady, that seeing it from the outside made something tighten in his throat. The chyron beneath the footage read, Video black teen removed from first-class flight after attendant complaint, father CEO of major firm. The nurse looked up and saw Ronald standing there. She recognized him. Her eyes went wide. She looked at the screen and back at him and back at the screen, and Ronald held her gaze for a moment and then turned away. He walked to the window at the end of the corridor and stood with his back to the nurse's station. His phone was buzzing continuously now. He took it out, turned it to silent, and put it back. He needed his father. He needed 5 minutes. Dr. Okonkwo came out of room 412 and walked past him with a brief nod, already moving on to her next patient. Ronald pushed off the wall and went back inside. Robert had his phone in his hand. He looked up when Ronald came in. You saw the news, Robert said. It wasn't a question. It's on the TV in the hallway. Robert nodded. He set the phone down on the tray. Sit down, Ron. Ronald sat. I need to tell you something, Robert said, and I need you to hear it clearly. He leaned forward slightly, which the monitors registered with a faint uptick. What happened to you this morning was not your fault. Not your clothing, not your attitude, not anything you said or didn't say. This did not happen because you did something wrong. I need you to know that I know that, fully, without qualification. Ronald held very still. I also need you to know, Robert continued, that this morning when you called me from that room when I heard your voice, that was the hardest thing I have experienced in a very long time, including whatever is happening with my heart. He paused. I want you to understand that everything I have done today and everything that is going to happen in the next days and weeks is not just about the airline or the contract or the stock price. It's about you. It's about making sure that what happened to you means something, that it changes something. Ronald's jaw was working. He was not going to cry in this hospital room. He had decided that in the car, and he was sticking to it. "Okay," he said. His voice came out level. "Okay," his father said. And then, with the particular practicality of a man who expressed love primarily through action, "Now, I'm going to call Donahue." Ronald looked at him. "Now. The timing is right." Robert picked up his phone. "I've let it sit long enough. Now I call from a position of strength and I tell him exactly what I expect." "What do you expect?" Robert considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. A public apology, not a statement of regret. An apology specifically for what was done to you with your name in language that does not equivocate. Immediate comprehensive retraining of their passenger interaction protocols. A formal commitment to an independent audit of their discrimination incident reports for the past 5 years. And a foundation partnership, Vertex Systems, and AeroVantage, co-funded specifically for equity in aviation access. He looked at Ronald. "That last part was your mother's idea. I called her 40 minutes ago." Ronald stared. "You called Mom. She's on her way back from London," Robert said. "She'll be here by tonight." He paused. "She said some things about the airline that I thought were quite articulate but that I won't repeat in a hospital setting." Something finally broke in Ronald's chest. It came out not as tears, but as something closer to laughter, brief, surprised, real. His father watched him with the expression of a man who had gotten the exact reaction he was looking for. "Okay," Ronald said, pulling himself back together. "Okay, make the call." Robert dialed. It was answered in less than half a ring. Donahue's office had clearly been waiting phone in hand for hours. "Mark," Robert said. His voice had changed completely. Gone was the quiet, worn quality of a man in a hospital bed. In its place was something Robert Thorne reserved for specific situations, not loudness, not aggression, but a kind of absolute, unhurried certainty that communicated in pure tonal information that the person listening was not in control of this conversation and would do well to understand that quickly. Ronald couldn't hear Donahue's side, but he could read the architecture of the conversation from his father's responses. "I appreciate that," Robert said. A pause. "No, Mark, I understand what the statement says. What I'm asking is whether you understand what I require." Another pause longer. "Let me be direct. My son was approached by your employee and told in front of a full first-class cabin that people like him don't belong there. He was then subjected to a security removal based on a complaint that had no substantiated basis. He is 17 years old. He was traveling to reach his hospitalized father." A pause. "I'm not asking you to agree with my characterization, Mark. I'm telling you what occurred." A longer pause. "That is not sufficient." And then, after a silence in which Donahue apparently made some kind of offer, "Mark, I have been in business for 20 years. I know what a litigation settlement offer disguised as a courtesy gesture looks like, and I am telling you that is not what this is going to be." Robert looked at Ronald across the room while he listened to whatever came next. His expression didn't change. "Here is what I need from you," he said finally. "I'm going to have Diana send you a document. It outlines the specific outcomes I expect. Review it. Take whatever time you need, but understand that the contract suspension remains in place until those outcomes are agreed to in writing, and the longer the suspension continues, the more the conversation changes." He paused. "Yes, you have until 4 o'clock this afternoon." He ended the call. The room was very quiet. Ronald realized he'd been holding his breath and released it slowly. "You gave him until 4 o'clock. "That's 5 hours, Robert said. "It's enough time to get his board aligned if he moves quickly, which he will because his board is watching that stock number and they are not having a good morning. And if he doesn't agree by 4? Robert picked up the phone again and texted something to Diana. "Then at 4:01, I call the Wall Street Journal and give them an on-record interview." He set the phone down. "But he'll agree by 4. He said it with the quiet certainty of someone who had run these calculations long before picking up the phone, and Ronald believed him, and also understood with a clarity that felt like it had arrived from somewhere new inside him what it meant to have this kind of power and to use it for something that mattered. He thought about the security room at JFK, about the plastic chairs and the fluorescent light, about Kent Miller writing his name on a notepad like it was a question. Ronald James Thorne, 17 years old, 84, Ashford Lane, Rye, New York. He had sat in that room and given his name like something that needed defending, and it had been in that moment exactly enough. His father's phone buzzed on the tray. Diana. Robert glanced at it and then looked up at Ronald with an expression that shifted slightly, something new in it. "What?" Ronald said. Robert turned the phone so he could see the screen. It was a link to a live social media feed. The video from the plane had been shared more than 40,000 times in 3 hours. The hashtag Ronald hadn't known there was a hashtag had reached the top 10 trending in the United States. Civil rights attorneys were posting. Politicians were posting. Former airline employees were posting, telling their own stories, attaching them to this one, like weight to an anchor. Ronald stared at the number, 40,000 shares. In 3 hours. "Dad," he said. "I know," his father said. I didn't." He stopped. Started again. "I just wanted to get on the plane." "I know that too," Robert said, quietly. "But sometimes the thing you're just trying to do becomes the thing everyone needed someone to do." Ronald looked at the phone for another moment. Then he set it back on the tray carefully like it might expand if handled wrong. Outside the window of room 4, 1-2 Atlanta, went about its business, the traffic and the heat, and the ordinary Tuesday of a city that didn't yet fully understand what was moving through it, what had been set in motion by one phone call from a boy in a security room to a man in a hospital bed, and what was going to come from it in the days and weeks ahead. The monitors beeped. Robert Thorne leaned back against his pillow and closed his eyes for just a moment. He looked for that single moment like someone who had carried something very heavy for a very long time and had not set it down, would not set it down, but had perhaps found briefly a slightly better grip. "Go get something to eat," he said. "From the cafeteria. I'm not negotiating on this." Ronald stood up. "Fine," he said. "I'll be back in 15 minutes. 20, his father said. "Eat slowly." Ronald walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. "Dad. I'm glad I made the flight." Robert opened one eye. The trace of the almost smile was back. "I made sure of it," he said. Ronald went to get food. In the corridor, the news was still playing on the television above the nurse's station, and the nurse who had recognized him earlier watched him pass with an expression of something not quite awe, not quite pity, but some specific combination of witness and understanding that people wear when they realize they have been present at the edge of something that is going to be remembered. Ronald walked past her without stopping. He had a father to get back to. Ronald ate a turkey sandwich from the cafeteria without tasting it. He sat at a corner table with his backpack on the chair beside him and his phone face down on the table, and he chewed and swallowed and chewed again with the mechanical focus of someone fueling a machine rather than feeding a person. Around him, the cafeteria moved through its ordinary rhythms. Visitors carrying trays, a family, speaking in low tones at the table nearest the window, a doctor in scrubs scrolling through something on a tablet while drinking coffee standing up. Nobody was looking at Ronald. Nobody recognized him down here. He was just a teenager in a gray hoodie eating a sandwich, and for exactly the length of that meal, he held on to that anonymity like something precious. He ate slowly the way his father had instructed. He thought about the 4 o'clock deadline. He thought about the 40,000 shares and whatever that number had climbed to now. He thought about his mother somewhere over the Atlantic on her way back, and he knew without being told what her face had looked like when she got that call because he had seen his mother's face in moments of controlled fury before, and it was one of the most quietly devastating things he had ever witnessed. He finished the sandwich. He went back upstairs. His father was on the phone again when he walked in. Robert held up one finger. "Give me a moment," and Ronald sat and waited. The conversation was short-clipped, conducted in the tonal shorthand of two people who had worked together long enough that full sentences were rarely necessary. "That's correct," Robert said. "Not before 3:45. Tell them we'll send confirmation when it's signed." He paused. "Yes, Diana has it." He ended the call and set the phone down. "Donahue," Ronald asked. "His general counsel," Robert said. "They're reviewing the document." He checked the time on the monitor display across the room. "It's 12:40. They have 3 hours and 20 minutes. And their counsel is not pushing back on the terms the way I expected, which tells me Donahue already decided before 9 a.m. that he was going to give us what we asked for. The legal review at this point is theater. They need to appear to have negotiated." Ronald looked at him. "So it's done." "Nearly." Robert paused. "There's one thing they've pushed back on." "Which part?" "The public apology." Robert folded his hands in his lap. "They want to use the phrase deeply regrets rather than sincerely apologizes. Their argument is that apologizes creates a more direct admission of liability in any subsequent civil action." Ronald considered this. "Does it matter the wording to us?" His father looked at him evenly. "Yes, it matters completely. An expression of regret is what you issue when something bad happens that was outside your control. An apology is what you give when your people did something wrong. Those are not the same thing, and the public knows the difference even if they can't always articulate why." Ronald nodded slowly. "So you're not accepting regrets?" "I am not accepting regrets," Robert said. His phone buzzed. He glanced at it and his expression shifted almost imperceptibly, but Ronald had been reading his father's face his entire life. "What is it?" Ronald asked. Robert turned the phone around. It was a text from a number Ronald didn't recognize, but the name attached to it was one he did. Senator Dianne Castillo, chair of the Senate Commerce Committee's Aviation Subcommittee, was informing Robert Thorne that her office had seen the footage from the flight, that her staff had been fielding calls about it since 10 a.m., and that she would very much appreciate a conversation at his earliest convenience. Ronald stared at the screen. "A senator." "Yes." "She reached out to you." "She reached out to my office first," Robert said. "Diana forwarded it." He set the phone down with the particular care of someone placing something in a specific location for a specific reason. "This changes the arithmetic somewhat." Ronald understood what he meant. A private contractual dispute between two corporations, even a significant one, had a certain contained quality, measurable in dollars and legal filings and stock movement. The moment a sitting U.S. senator with jurisdiction over aviation made direct contact, the walls of containment expanded in every direction simultaneously. This was no longer just about AeroVantage Airlines. This was becoming about policy, about the structures and protocols and systemic assumptions that had made it possible for Becky Marsh to walk up to seat 3A and say what she said with the confidence of someone who expected to be backed up by the institution around her. Ronald thought about that confidence, about how specific it was, about how she hadn't hesitated, about how Greg had stood at that gate counter doing his slow, deliberate assessment of a teenager in a hoodie without a flicker of uncertainty, because every system he'd ever operated inside had taught him that his assessment was valid. "Can I say something?" Ronald said. "Always," his father said. "I want to be part of it." Ronald met his father's eyes directly. "Whatever happens next, the senator, the media, the foundation piece, I want to be in the room. I don't want to be the story that other people tell. I want to tell it." Robert was quiet for a long moment. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm. "You're 17?" Robert said. "I was 17 this morning too," Ronald said. "That didn't stop any of it from happening." Something moved through his father's expression, something Robert Thorne did not show often, not in boardrooms, not in negotiations, not in any context where he was performing the version of himself that the world expected. But here in this room, it moved across his face openly and briefly, something close to being undone. "All right," Robert said. "You're in the room." Ronald exhaled, nodded once, straightened his back. The afternoon built around them with a gathering momentum that Ronald could feel even from a hospital room. Calls came in and were fielded by Diana, who had set up a mobile command of sorts in the family lounge, 2 doors down her laptop, her phone a legal pad covered in her rapid shorthand, 2 cups of coffee at various stages of cooling. The inquiries were coming from everywhere. 3 major news networks, 2 civil rights organizations, a coalition of black travel professionals who had released a statement of solidarity within 30 minutes of the video going viral. A former AeroVantage pilot who had called the airline's official tip line to report that what he'd seen in the footage was consistent with a pattern he had personally witnessed and reported internally twice without action. That last one landed differently. Diana brought it to Robert's room at 1:15 p.m., presenting it with the careful framing of someone who understood its implications. "His name is Captain Jerome Ellis," she said. "Retired AeroVantage, 12 years of service. He submitted formal discrimination complaints in 2019 and 2021, both regarding first-class passenger treatment. Both complaints were closed without documented resolution." Robert looked at the information for a moment, then at Ronald. "You see what this does?" Ronald saw. What had looked like one incident this morning, seat 3 of Becky Marsh, was now attaching itself to a documented history, a pattern, the kind of thing that transformed a personnel matter into a structural indictment. "Can we talk to him?" Ronald asked. "Ellis." Diana glanced at Robert. Robert nodded. "Set it up," he said. She left. Robert shifted against his pillow and pressed the call button for his nurse. When she appeared, a capable, no-nonsense woman named Cheryl, who had taken Robert's particular energy in stride since his admission, he asked with the tone of someone making a reasonable request rather than an imposition whether it would be possible to have a second chair brought into the room. Cheryl looked at the room, at the monitors, at the IV line, at the general evidence of a person who was supposed to be resting. "You're supposed to be reducing your stress, Mr. Thorne," she said. "I'm aware of that," he said. "I'm asking about a chair." She brought the chair. At 1:47 p.m., Captain Jerome Ellis called into a 3-way line that Diana had arranged. His voice was steady and unhurried, the voice of a man who had spent decades in the air and had developed the particular calm of someone accustomed to managing significant things without visible panic. "Mr. Thorne," he said, "I want to start by saying I'm sorry about what happened to your son. And I want to say directly what I saw in that footage is not a surprise to me. It is not an isolated event. It is Tuesday." "Tuesday," Robert repeated. "It happens on ordinary days," Ellis said. "It happens on Tuesdays and Wednesdays and slow Thursday mornings. It happens when nobody is recording. It happens in smaller ways that don't escalate to marshals, but that accumulate. I reported it because I believed in the system. The system closed my reports and moved on." Ronald leaned forward in his chair. "Captain Ellis," he said. He hadn't planned to speak. It came out before he made the decision. "What happened specifically in those 2 complaints?" A brief pause on the line. Then, "Is this Ronald?" "Yes, sir." "In 2019, I reported a specific flight attendant on the Atlanta-Miami route for a pattern of behavior toward black passengers in first-class unnecessary verification requests, differential service quality, dismissive interactions. The report was filed, reviewed by a supervisor, and closed as an interpersonal issue without corrective action." A pause. "The flight attendant's name was Becky Marsh." The room went completely silent. Ronald felt the hair on his arms stand up. Robert's jaw had set into something carved and still. He was looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man confirming a calculation he had already suspected but needed to hear to make it real. "Same person," Ronald said. "Same person," Ellis confirmed quietly. "And when I filed the second complaint in 2021, a different incident, a different passenger, similar circumstances, her name came up in the documentation again. The airline's response was to close the complaint and offer me a lateral reassignment. I retired 6 months later." Diana's pen had stopped moving on her legal pad. She was looking at Robert. Robert looked at Ronald. Ronald understood in that moment the full shape of what this morning had been. It hadn't been a failure of individual judgment. It hadn't been one bad employee having one bad morning. Becky Marsh had done this before. She had done it in 2019 and she had done it in 2021. And the airline had known, and the airline had closed the file and moved on, and let her keep doing it until she did it to the wrong person on a day when someone was recording. The specific texture of Ronald's anger shifted. It had been personal before, directed at faces, at a tone of voice, at the particular humiliation of being walked through a terminal. Now it expanded into something larger and colder and more structural. The kind of anger that has a long shelf life. The kind that doesn't burn out, but calcifies into something useful. "Captain Ellis," Robert said, "I'd like to ask whether you'd be willing to make your complaints part of a formal record that we are compiling." "That's why I called," Ellis said simply. After the call ended, the room held its weight for a moment. Then Robert said quietly, but with a precision that meant he was already several steps ahead, "Diana, the document we sent Donahue's counsel, add a 6th requirement." Diana's pen was already moving. "I'm listening." "A full independent review of every discrimination complaint filed against AeroVantage personnel over the past 7 years, not their internal review. An external firm, agreed upon by both parties, with a public-facing summary of findings." Diana wrote, "That's going to hit resistance." "They'll accept it," Robert said, "because the alternative, as of about 4 minutes ago, is that I have a retired captain prepared to go on record with documented complaints that were actively suppressed, and that changes every conversation they're planning to have." He was right. Ronald could see that he was right, could see the architecture of leverage shifting in real time, the way one piece of information repositioned everything around it, like a keystone being set. His phone vibrated. He looked at it. A text from a number he didn't know, which began, "My name is Marcus Webb, and I'm your father's lead attorney. I'm about to send you a brief document. Your father wants you to read it before 3 p.m. Ronald looked up. "Your attorney is texting me." "Good," Robert said. "He moves fast." The document arrived 60 seconds later. It was 4 pages. Ronald read it once quickly and then again slowly. It was a formal declaration of intent, not yet a legal filing, but the precursor to one outlining the events of the morning in precise chronological detail, establishing the legal basis for claims, including racial discrimination in public accommodation, unlawful detention of a minor, and institutional negligence in the management of documented employee misconduct. At the bottom, in a note formatted separately from the legal language Marcus Webb had written, Ronald, "This document will not be filed without your explicit agreement. Your father wanted you to understand what is available to you and to make your own decision." Ronald read that last sentence twice. "Your own decision." He looked at his father. Robert was watching him with the patient expression of a man who had already decided where he stood and was genuinely, completely prepared to accept wherever his son stood. "You're not going to tell me what to do with this," Ronald said. "No," Robert said. "I'm not." "You have opinions." "Very strong ones," Robert agreed, "which I will keep to myself for as long as necessary." Ronald looked at the document again. He thought about what filing it would mean, the months of process, the visibility, the sustained exposure of what had already been one of the worst mornings of his life. He thought about what not filing it would mean, about Becky Marsh and whatever came after termination without legal consequence, about Captain Jerome Ellis and his 2 closed reports, about the passenger in 2021 who had experienced something similar and whose name was somewhere in a closed file in AeroVantage's HR system and who had never heard an apology. "I need an hour to think about it," Ronald said. "You have until 3, his father said. At 2:20 p.m., Diana appeared in the doorway with an expression that Ronald had begun to recognize as her signal for significant incoming information. "Donahue's counsel called," she said. "They've accepted all 6 terms." Robert's face showed nothing. "The apology language sincerely apologizes," Diana said. "They dropped the regrets." Robert looked at Ronald. Ronald looked back. "All right, Robert said. "There's more," Diana said. She came fully into the room and set her laptop on the tray facing Robert. On the screen was a prepared statement from Aerovantage Airlines pending Robert's sign-off on the agreement. It was 3 paragraphs. The first named Ronald explicitly. The second named Becky Marsh's conduct explicitly. The third outlined the commitments the airline was making, the external review, the retraining program, the foundation partnership in language that was specific and unambiguous and would be impossible to quietly walk back later. Robert read it. His expression was entirely still. Ronald watched his father's eyes move across the screen and thought about all the things that had gone into this moment. The 3:47 a.m. phone call, the security room, the plastic chairs, the 40,000 shares, Captain Ellis Senator Castillo, Marcus Webb's 4-page document, all of it collapsing into 3 paragraphs on a hospital tray in Atlanta at 2:20 in the afternoon. "It's adequate," Robert said. "Should I confirm acceptance?" Diana asked. Robert looked at Ronald. "What do you think?" Ronald looked at the screen. He read the second paragraph again, the part with his name in it. The part that said what Becky Marsh had said and what it was, and that the airline was sorry, not regretful, sorry for what had been done to him. "Tell them yes," Ronald said. Diana typed. At 2:31 p.m., the agreement was signed digitally by both parties. At 2:45 p.m., Aerovantage Airlines published the statement on their official website and social channels simultaneously. Ronald found out it had gone live when his phone, which had been silent on Diana's instruction, suddenly produced a sustained vibration that didn't stop, not individual notifications, but a continuous cascade message stacked on message on message, the digital equivalent of a wave that had been building offshore for hours and had just made landfall. He turned the phone over and looked at it. The statement was being shared faster than the original video had been. News networks were running it live. The hashtag had crested into the top 3 trending in the country. The phone calls to Senator Castillo's office had apparently been intense enough that she'd issued her own statement in response to the airlines calling the incident a clear example of systemic bias requiring legislative attention, and announcing that her subcommittee would be opening a formal inquiry into passenger discrimination practices across major U.S. carriers. A formal congressional inquiry. Ronald set the phone down on the arm of his chair and sat very still for a moment. He thought about seat 3A, about the particular quality of the silence in the first-class cabin when Becky had said what she said, about the man in the navy suit across the aisle who had watched and not spoken, about the couple in their 60s who had exchanged that glance, about all the other times in all the other cabins on all the other Tuesdays when the silence had held and no one had been recording and the file had been closed and the person in the seat had swallowed what happened to them and gotten off the plane and carried it home and the airline had moved on. His mother called at 2:53 p.m. She was still in the air somewhere over the ocean on a diverted connection, and the call broke up twice before stabilizing. "Ronald." Her voice was the voice she used when she was being very, very careful to stay in control of something. "Are you all right? I need you to tell me specifically." "I'm fine, Mom," he said. "I'm with Dad. He's okay. We've handled it." "I know you've handled it. Diana briefed me at noon." A pause in which the controlled quality of her voice strained very slightly at its edges. "I need you to hear me say that I am proud of you. What you did in that room, the way you conducted yourself, Ronald, that took more strength than most adults have access to." His throat tightened. He breathed through it. "The statement went out," he said. "They agreed to everything." "I know." Her voice had steadied again. "I'll be there by 8 tonight. Tell your father I'm bringing him the good soup from the place on Peachtree." "He's supposed to be on a specific diet." "I know what diet he's on," she said. "It's soup. Tell him." She hung up. Ronald held the phone for a moment and then set it down and looked at his father, who had been listening to the one-sided conversation with an expression that was doing its best to be neutral and failing in small specific ways. "She's bringing soup," Ronald said. "She always brings soup," Robert said. "Every hospital I've ever been in, she walks in with that container like it's the solution to everything." "Is it?" Robert considered. Largely, he said. Then, Marcus called while you were on with your mother. Ronald looked at him. The filing. He wanted to know your decision. Ronald had been thinking about it for the past hour. Through the statement going live and the phone lighting up and his mother's call, he'd been turning it over, all 4 pages of it, all the legal precision of it, all the weight of what it represented and what it required. I want a file, Ronald said. Not because I want money, I want the record. I want a court document that says specifically what happened and specifically what it was, so that 30 years from now, if someone pulls that file, it says exactly this on this date, on this airline, to this kid, for this reason. I want it to exist. Robert looked at him for a long moment. The monitors beeped. The afternoon light was changing, moving through the window behind him, casting a different quality of warmth into the room than it had an hour ago. That, his father said, is the right reason. He picked up his phone and called Marcus Webb. The conversation lasted 90 seconds. When it was over, Robert set the phone down and folded his hands back in his lap, and there was something settled in his posture. Not resolution exactly, because there were still months of process ahead, and the congressional inquiry was just beginning, and the foundation partnership hadn't been structured yet, and Kent Miller still had a federal review to answer to, but something that occupied the same space that resolution does when it's still in formation. At 3:40 p.m., a notification appeared on Ronald's phone that he almost missed among all the others. It was from a news alert he'd set up long ago for Vertex Systems, an old habit from middle school when he'd been fascinated by what his father's company was doing and had wanted to keep track. The alert read, Aerovantage Airlines stock recovers partial losses following public statement analysts note unprecedented speed of institutional response. Ronald stared at the words partial losses. The stock had gone down 6% and come back, not all the way, not back to where it had been this morning before any of this had happened, but enough to signal that the market in its cold and unsentimental way had registered the apology and the commitments and had decided they were worth something. Ronald thought about that, about the idea that the market had weighed what happened to him this morning, had assigned it a number, had measured the response, had moved accordingly. It was an uncomfortable thing to sit with, the monetization of someone else's dignity. But it was also, he thought, information about how the world actually worked, about what it took to make systems move. His father was watching him. "What are you thinking?" Robert asked. Ronald looked up. "I'm thinking about how to make sure this matters past the news cycle," he said. "The statement goes out today, the inquiry opens next week, and then in 3 months something else happens, and this becomes a footnote." "That's a legitimate concern," Robert said. "So what do we do about it?" Robert was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, Atlanta was beginning its late afternoon shift into the softer light of early evening. Somewhere in this city, people were getting off work, picking up children from school, sitting in traffic, going about the particular ordinary business of their lives, without knowing that 35 feet above street level, in a hospital on Peachtree, a 17-year-old and his father were sitting across from each other, working out what to do with the thing that had been given to them. Not asked for, not planned, but given by one woman's cruelty on an ordinary Tuesday morning. "The foundation," Robert said. "That's the answer to what you're asking. The statement lasts a news cycle. The inquiry lasts a season, but a funded, structured, institutionally committed foundation with specific mandates and measurable outcomes that lasts." "I want to be involved in building it," Ronald said. "I was counting on that," his father said. Ronald leaned back in his chair. He was exhausted. He was more tired than he had ever been in his life, and he was 17, and his father was in a hospital bed, and somewhere in New York, a woman named Becky Marsh was going through whatever today meant for her, and somewhere in Atlanta, a retired pilot named Jerome Ellis had made a phone call, and finally, after 7 years, felt the weight of it land somewhere other than a closed file. The monitors beeped. Robert Thorne closed his eyes, not from defeat or exhaustion, but from the specific peace of a man who has done what needed to be done and can now briefly allow himself to be still. Ronald watched his father rest, and he stayed in the chair, and he did not leave, and the afternoon moved around them both. Ronald heard her before he saw her the particular rhythm of her heels in the corridor, brisk and purposeful, the kind of walk that parted crowds without requiring anyone to be asked to move. She came through the door of room 412 with a container of soup in one hand and her carry-on still on her shoulder because she had not stopped at the family lounge, had not stopped anywhere, had come directly from the elevator to this room. And when she saw Ronald sitting in the chair beside his father's bed, she stopped walking for exactly 1 second. Just 1 second. Then she crossed the room and put her hand on the side of his face, and Ronald, who had held it together through the security room and the terminal and the flight and the cafeteria and every phone call and every decision and every moment of the last 16 hours, felt something give way in his chest in a place he hadn't known was still held tight. "Hi, Mom," he said. "Hi, baby," she said quietly just for him. She held his face in her hand for a moment longer. Then she straightened up, set the soup on the tray with the controlled precision of someone managing their own emotions through task completion, and looked at Robert. "You look better than I expected," she said. "I feel better than I expected," he said. "That's because you spent the day working instead of resting, which is exactly what the cardiologist told you not to do, and which I am going to address with you tomorrow when I have more energy." She sat on the edge of the bed beside him. "But not tonight." "Not tonight," he agreed. She reached over and took his hand. The three of them sat together in the room for a few minutes without any of them speaking, and the silence was not the silence of people who had nothing to say, but the silence of people who had said the necessary things, and were now simply occupying the same space. And that was enough. More than enough. Then Catherine looked at Ronald with the focused attention she brought to things she had been thinking about on long flights and needed to say clearly. "I've been briefed," she said. "Diana talked me through everything. The statement, the agreement, the filing, the captain, the senator." She paused. "I want to know how you are. Not what happened. I know what happened. How are you?" Ronald thought about it honestly. "I'm tired," he said. "I'm angrier than I've let myself feel yet because I've been busy. And I think tomorrow or the day after it's going to hit me in a way that it hasn't fully hit me yet." Catherine nodded. "That's true, and that's normal, and I want you to let it hit when it comes." She held his eyes. "Don't compress it. Don't manage it. Let it be what it is." "I know," Ronald said. "Do you?" He almost smiled. "I learned it from watching you tell Dad the same thing for 15 years. Robert from the bed said nothing, but the quality of his silence was one of complete agreement. Catherine stayed until 11. She sat with Robert while he ate the soup, which he accepted without argument, which told Ronald more about how tired his father actually was than any of the monitors had. And she talked through the next steps with Diana, who appeared and disappeared with the quiet efficiency of someone conducting a small operation. The foundation structure. The communications plan. The congressional testimony that Senator Castillo's office had already, through a formal request transmitted to Marcus Webb at 6 p.m., asked Robert to consider providing. Ronald fell asleep in the chair sometime after 10. He didn't mean to. He surfaced briefly around 11 to find his mother standing over him with a hospital blanket, and he let her put it over him without saying anything, and he went back under. He slept without dreaming, which was the sleep of someone who has been operating at full capacity for so long that the system, when it finally powers down, does so completely. He woke at 6:17 a.m. to the sound of his father's voice, low and measured, on the phone. The room was gray with early light. The monitors were steady. Robert was sitting up more alert than he'd looked yesterday. Color returned to his face in a way that made something loosen in Ronald's chest. "That's acceptable," Robert was saying. "Tell his office we'll confirm by noon." A pause. "No, Ronald will be with me. That's not negotiable." He ended the call and looked over at his son. "Good morning." "Who was that?" Ronald asked, pushing the blanket off. "Senator Castillo's chief of staff," Robert said. "She wants us in Washington next week. Joint testimony before the aviation subcommittee. She's framing it as a hearing on passenger discrimination protocols. But the real purpose is to build a legislative record for mandatory bias retraining requirements across all major carriers. Ronald sat up straight. Both of us. I told them you were not optional, Robert said simply. If they want me, they get you. Ronald absorbed this. I've never testified before Congress. I have, Robert said. Twice. You'll be fine. You're better under pressure than you think. A pause. You're better under pressure than most people I've met in 40 years of business. You demonstrated that yesterday. Ronald looked at his hands. I was scared the whole time. I know, his father said. That's exactly what I mean. Dr. Okonkwo came in at 7:30 with updated numbers that she described in her precise and non-dramatizing way as encouraging. The enzyme levels were trending in the right direction. The arrhythmia that had brought Robert in 2 days ago had stabilized. She wanted another 24 hours of monitoring, and then she would discuss discharge. Robert accepted this without attempting to negotiate, which Ronald recognized as a significant concession, and which told him his father had somewhere in the night made a decision to actually rest for the remaining hours of his hospital stay. Catherine arrived at 8 a.m. with coffee from the place on Peachtree, and a look that said she had also noticed the concession and was choosing to say nothing about it in order to protect the fragile ecosystem of her husband's compliance. At 9 a.m., Diana brought a tablet into the room with the morning's news summary. She set it on the tray and stepped back, and Ronald leaned over to read it alongside his father. The AeroVantage story had not diminished overnight. It had compounded. The former Captain Jerome Ellis had given his first on-record interview to the Washington Post, published at midnight, in which he described his 2 closed complaints in precise detail and named the specific supervisors who had processed and dismissed them. 3 other former AeroVantage employees had come forward through social media with corroborating accounts, each describing incidents that followed a pattern consistent enough to be structural. A passenger advocacy group had released a data analysis of FAA complaint records over 5 years, showing that black passengers filed discrimination complaints at AeroVantage at a rate 340% higher than white passengers on equivalent routes, and that the resolution rate of those complaints, meaning any documented corrective action, was under 4%. Under 4%. Ronald read that number twice. He said it aloud quietly to himself, feeling its shape. Robert watched him. That's the number that changes the conversation, he said. That's the number that takes this from an incident to a system. At 9:47 a.m., Marcus Webb called. Ronald sat close enough to hear both sides. The filing is going in this afternoon, Marcus said. Federal District Court, Northern District of Georgia. We've added a claim under Section 1981, in addition to the civil rights accommodation claims given the documented history of complaint suppression. Judge Hawthorne has the duty assignment this week. She's thorough. A pause. There's something else. Tell me, Robert said. Kent Miller's attorney reached out this morning. Miller wants to provide a statement voluntarily outside the federal review process. His attorney says he wants to go on record that the complaint from the flight attendant did not meet the evidentiary threshold that should have triggered a passenger removal, and that he acted on institutional pressure rather than independent security judgment. The room was very quiet. Ronald looked at his father. Robert's expression had not changed, but his eyes had shifted with the subtle recalibration of someone processing a development they had not fully anticipated. He's turning, Ronald said. He's protecting himself, Robert said. But the effect is the same. Does it help us? Ronald asked Marcus directly. Significantly, Marcus said. A federal air marshal's voluntary statement that the removal lacked proper evidentiary basis essentially validates every claim in your filing before we've set foot in a courtroom. It also opens AeroVantage to additional negligence exposure for the manner in which the complaint was communicated to federal personnel. A pause. To put it simply, yes, it helps. Robert said, accept the statement. Keep the door open. He paused. And Marcus, make sure the court filing specifically references the 4% resolution rate from the advocacy group's analysis. I want that number in the record. Already in the draft, Marcus said. He ended the call. Catherine from her chair in the corner looked at Robert over the rim of her coffee cup. 4%, she said. 4%, he confirmed. That's not negligence, she said. That's policy. Nobody disagreed. The morning moved. Ronald spent an hour on a call with Senator Castillo's chief of staff, a sharp, fast-talking woman named Priya Menon, who spoke in the compressed syntax of someone who managed 17 competing priorities at all times and had learned to be efficient about all of them. She walked Ronald through the structure of the hearing, the format, the likely questions, the importance of speaking from personal experience, rather than policy framing the fact that his testimony as a minor, who had been directly subjected to what the hearing was examining, would carry a weight that no expert witness could replicate. You don't need to be a policy expert, Priya said. You just need to tell the truth of what happened to you clearly and completely. Can you do that? I've been doing it since yesterday morning, Ronald said. A brief pause. Fair point, she said. We'll be in touch. At 11:15 a.m. something happened that no one had planned for. Diana appeared in the doorway with an expression Ronald hadn't seen from her before, not alarmed, but unsettled in a particular way, like someone who had received information that required a new category. What? Robert said immediately. Becky Marsh, Diana said carefully, has given an interview. It went up 20 minutes ago. The room tightened. To whom? Robert asked. A mid-market digital outlet. The interview is... Diana paused, choosing words. She's presenting herself as a victim of overreaction. Her position is that she was performing standard passenger verification procedures, that she never intended any discriminatory action, and that her termination was disproportionate. Ronald's jaw set. His mother put her coffee down. Robert said nothing for a moment. His hands were very still on the blanket. Then, pull it up. Diana turned the tablet toward him. He read. Ronald read over his father's shoulder, his eyes moving through the quotes, the carefully constructed language of someone who had been coached every sentence, plausible enough on its own, the total effect adding up to a version of Tuesday Morning that bore no resemblance to what had been on the video that 40 million people had now watched. When Robert set the tablet down, his expression was the expression Ronald associated with his father at his most deliberate. The kind of deliberate that was not reactive, that had already moved past the first response and was operating several moves ahead. She has the right to speak, Robert said. That's fine. She's calling it overreaction, Ronald said. He heard the edge in his own voice. He didn't try to remove it. I know, his father said. And the video exists, and Captain Ellis's interview exists, and the 4% resolution rate exists, and our court filing will exist in 3 hours. He looked at Ronald. She can say whatever she wants. The record will do the work. Ronald looked at the tablet. He thought about what it had felt like to sit in 3A and feel Becky Marsh's certainty pressing down on him, the specific quality of her assumption, how solid it was, how completely she had not questioned it for even 1 second. And he thought about her using that same certainty now repackaged in an interview to describe herself as a person wrongly treated. Something moved through him. Not the hot anger that had already transformed into the colder, more structural thing he'd been carrying since Captain Ellis said Becky Marsh's name on the phone. This was something else, something almost like recognition, of how durable that kind of certainty was, of how much work it took to dismantle it, of how long it took, of how the work was not ever done in a day or a week or a news cycle. She believes it, Ronald said, not with sympathy, just with the accuracy of observation. She actually believes her version. Robert looked at him. Yes, he said. She does. That's the hardest part of this to hold on to. Not the malice, the belief. Ronald sat with that. Catherine was watching her son with the careful attention of a mother who is witnessing her child arrive at an understanding that cannot be given or explained, but only arrived at, and who knows that the arriving is its own form of growing, and that growing sometimes looks from the outside like grief. At 1:30 p.m., Marcus Webb confirmed that the filing had been submitted to the Federal District Court. At 1:47 p.m., the court acknowledged receipt. At 2:10 p.m., three separate legal analysts on cable news had pulled the filing and were discussing it on live television, and the specific language of the Section 1981 claim, its implications, its historical weight, what it required to prove, and what the documented evidence suggested about the probability of that proof was being analyzed in the kind of detail that told Ronald the filing was going to generate its own momentum, separate from the statement, separate from the video, separate from any individual voice. The record existed now, officially, indelibly, in the precise and unambiguous language of a federal court filing. Ronald thought about what he'd told his father yesterday. I want a court document that says specifically what happened and specifically what it was, so that 30 years from now, if someone pulls that file, it says exactly this. He had that now. At 3:30 p.m., something arrived that no one had anticipated. Not a call, not a statement, not a legal document. An email addressed to Robert Thorne from an address Ronald didn't recognize with the subject line, I was on that plane. Row 7, Seat B. Robert read it aloud. The email was from a man named David Carver, 63 years old, a retired school teacher from Baltimore. He had been in Row 7, Seat B on the flight from JFK to Atlanta the previous morning. He had heard every word Becky Marsh had said. He had watched Kent Miller walk Ronald out. He had sat in his seat and done nothing, and he had been thinking about that ever since, and he wanted Robert Thorne to know that he was sorry, not for what the airline had done, but for his own silence. For the calculation he had made in real time that it was not his place, that it would only make things worse, that someone else would speak, that the boy would be fine. He had made all of those calculations, and he had sat, and he had not spoken, and he had gotten off the plane, and he had driven home, and he had not been able to sleep that night, and he had seen the video, and he had seen the statement, and he had sat down and written this email because he felt that it needed to be said by a person who had been there and had failed the moment. He ended the email by saying, "If there is anything I can do, I would like to do it. I should have said something. I didn't. I'm sorry." When Robert finished reading, the room was very quiet. Ronald stared at the tray where the tablet was sitting. He thought about Row 7, Seat B, about the people he'd been aware of in peripheral ways during the whole thing, the faces he'd caught in his peripheral vision, the particular quality of their watching. He had known in real time that no one was going to speak. He had known it and had not blamed them for it because he understood the calculation. Because it was real, because people made it for reasons that were human and complicated and fear-adjacent. But the email was also real. And it was its own kind of courage, not the courage of the moment, but the courage of accountability after the fact, which was a different and maybe more honest kind. "Can I write back to him?" Ronald asked. Robert looked at him. "Of course." Ronald took the tablet. He sat for a moment with it, thinking about what to say to a 63-year-old retired school teacher who had been in Row 7, Seat B, and had watched and said nothing, and had not been able to sleep, and had written an email. He thought about what his father would say, and what his mother would say, and then he set both of those aside and thought about what he, Ronald James Thorne, 17 years old, wanted to say. He typed, "Mr. Carver, thank you for writing. I know it wasn't easy. I want you to know that I don't think silence in a moment like that makes someone a bad person. It makes them a person who is unprepared for something they'd never been prepared for. What you're doing now, writing this, acknowledging it, that matters. The question of what people do after is just as important as what they do during, and you're answering it. If you're willing, I'd like to add your name to a list of witnesses who've agreed to support the efforts we're building around this, not to relive it, to make sure it means something going forward. Ronald Thorne." He handed the tablet to his father without showing it. Robert read it, and his expression did the thing it had done yesterday in this room, the thing Ronald could only see because he knew his father's face well enough to catch what the face was working to contain. "Send it," Robert said. Ronald sent it. The days that followed moved with the compressed intensity of something that had been set in motion at the top of a long slope and was gathering speed as it descended. The congressional hearing was confirmed for the following Tuesday. Robert was discharged from Piedmont on Thursday morning under Dr. Okonkwo's instructions to reduce his stress load and her clear awareness that those instructions would be partially complied with at best, which she had accepted as the realistic outcome. He walked out of the hospital in the early morning light with Catherine on one side and Ronald on the other, and he walked the way Ronald had watched him walk his entire life, without performance, without announcement, simply placing one foot in front of the other, with the certainty of someone who knows where they are going and has already decided to get there. The Vertex AeroVantage Foundation was formally structured that Friday, named the Open Seat Initiative. Ronald's suggestion offered quietly accepted immediately. It was capitalized at $20 million from the Vertex side and $15 million from AeroVantage, with an independent board of directors that included Captain Jerome Ellis Priamenon from Senator Castillo's office as an advisor, and at the specific insistence of both Robert and Catherine, a rotating seat reserved for a young person under 25 who had experienced discrimination in air travel. The mandate was explicit to fund bias training, independent complaint review, passenger advocacy, and legal support for discrimination cases across the entire aviation industry. Not one airline, all of them. The Tuesday hearing lasted 4 hours. Robert testified first. He was methodical, thorough, measured the testimony of a man who had spent 20 years in rooms exactly like this one, and who knew how to build an argument that a senator's staff could quote in a legislative record. He presented the documented complaint history, the 4% resolution rate, the structural evidence, and the business case for mandatory industry-wide reform in language that was simultaneously technically precise and completely accessible to anyone listening. Then Ronald testified. He had not prepared remarks. He had talked to Marcus about it and to his mother, and he had decided that prepared remarks were not what this moment required. He sat in the chair across from the subcommittee, the room packed behind him with journalists and advocates and observers, and David Carver, who had flown in from Baltimore at his own expense and was sitting in the third row, and Ronald told the truth. He started with the phone call at 3:47 in the morning. He talked about dressing in 6 minutes and grabbing a backpack and calling a car and not thinking about what he was wearing because he was thinking about his father's voice. He talked about Greg at the gate counter doing the slow assessment. He talked about 3A and Becky Marsh and the specific words she had said and what those words had felt like, not the emotion of them, but the mechanics, the certainty behind them, the institutional backing that certainty required to exist, the system that had been teaching people like Becky Marsh that their assessment was valid for long enough that the behavior had become effortless. He talked about the security room and the plastic chairs and the fluorescent light and Kent Miller writing his name on a notepad like it was a question. He talked about calling his father. He talked about what it cost to maintain composure in that room when what he was actually feeling was something that 17-year-olds should not have to know how to contain. Senator Castillo, who had been listening without interruption, leaned forward when he paused. "Ronald," she said, "what do you want this committee to do with what you've told us today?" Ronald looked at her directly. "I want you to make it structural," he said. "Not a fine, not a statement, not a training day that employees sit through and then go back to what they were doing. I want federal standards with teeth that govern how passenger complaints are handled, how discrimination reports are reviewed, and what happens when airlines suppress those reports. I want the 4% resolution rate to become impossible. I want a kid who gets on a plane next year wearing a hoodie to sit in his seat and not have to know what I know about how to survive the experience of being doubted in public." He paused. "That's what I want. Not for me. For the next one." The hearing room was silent for a long moment. David Carver in the third row pressed his fist to his mouth. Catherine, beside Robert in the gallery, did not look away from her son. Robert Thorne looked at Ronald across the room with the full, uncalculated weight of everything a father carries for his child, the fear and the pride and the grief and the love and the particular specific awareness of watching a person you made become more than you knew they were, and he did not look away either. 6 weeks after the hearing, the Senate Commerce Committee advanced the Civil Aviation Non-Discrimination Act to a full-floor vote. The legislation established mandatory federal standards for passenger discrimination complaint procedures, required independent third-party review of unresolved complaints, and created financial penalties for airlines with documented patterns of suppression. It passed the Senate 61-39. The House version moved through committee in 8 weeks, an unusually swift timeline that the bill's sponsors attributed to the volume of constituent contact their offices had received from passengers, from airline employees, from people who had experienced something like what happened in Seat 3A and had for years had no legislation to point to. The president signed the bill into law on a Wednesday morning. Ronald watched the signing ceremony on his laptop from his bedroom in Rye, New York, sitting at his desk in a gray hoodie because it was cold and it was the warmest thing he owned, and it was what he reached for first. His phone buzzed. His father. He answered. "Are you watching?" Robert said. "Yes," Ronald said. A pause, in which both of them watched in their separate places, Atlanta and New York hospital room, long behind them, the ordinary geography of their lives surrounding them again, as a pen moved across a document and made something official that had not been official before. "Dad," Ronald said. What she said to me, on the plane." He paused. "It's in the congressional record now." Robert was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "It is." "Verbatim," Ronald said. "I made sure they used the exact words. In the legislative history, people like you don't belong up here, on the record, permanently." His father exhaled. It was a small sound, almost nothing, but Ronald heard everything in it. "Good," Robert said. "That's where it belongs." Ronald looked at the screen, at the pen moving, at the thing being made real. He had gotten on a plane in a gray hoodie to reach his father, and a woman with absolute certainty in her own judgment had decided that his presence required an explanation. She had said the words out loud in front of a cabin full of people, and nobody had spoken, and he had been walked through a terminal, and he had sat in a plastic chair under fluorescent light and given his name like something that needed defending. And then the law changed. Not because the world became kind overnight, not because the people who held the assumptions that produced that moment had let them go, but because one phone call had been made, and one record had been built, and one boy had stood in front of a Senate subcommittee and said, "I want the next one to be protected." Ronald James Thorne, 17 years old, closed his laptop, picked up his backpack, and went to school. The seat on that plane seat, 3A window first class, had always belonged to him. It had belonged to him before he sat in it, and it had belonged to him while they were trying to take it, and it belonged to him still. It would belong to every person who came after him, who had the right to sit wherever their ticket said, without having to defend the right to exist in the space they had paid for. That was not a gift the law had given. That was a truth the law had finally caught up to. And no one, no flight attendant, no gate agent, no institution built on the assumption that some people needed to justify their presence would ever make it otherwise again.